Back at you again. Good afternoon, all. Yes, I am Senator James Sanders Jr. calling you from the Empire State. I'm reaching out because the Empire State, is part of the United States, and the United States should be part of the world, and sometimes it is. I am New York State Senator James Sanders Jr., and this show is absolutely called Let's Be Clear. Here we cut the fat away. Here we try to speak English. We try to get really what is being said. What is the essence of all of the things that we speak about? So all of that fuzzy thinking that you're used to, all of those fuzzy conversations, well, if you're looking for that fuzzy stuff, you're in the wrong place. But if you are looking for the truth, then my friends, Pilgrim, you have arrived. Today, we are at the 100th anniversary of an incredible massacre. And we're speaking of the Tulsa Massacre. We're speaking of what happened to us in Black Wall Street. And we're going to, I could tell you about it, but then again, why should I when I have the author of the book on the leading book on the subject who will speak and tell you of it himself. And of course, I am speaking of Mr. Hannibal Johnson. Mr. Johnson, I'm glad that you are here. Would you be kind enough to say what was Black Wall Street and what happened to it and what brings us to this moment today?
Absolutely, and I'll be brief. Black Wall Street is a reference to the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's roughly a 35 square block area historically, and it was a concentration of mostly small businesses, commercial enterprises like movie theaters, dance halls, barber shops, laundries, shoe shine shops, hotels, a jitney service, confectionaries, all manner of small businesses, coupled with professionals, service providers like doctors, lawyers, accountants, and dentists. Now, the community was called initially the Negro Wall Street of America by Booker T. Washington. That later morphed into Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street is in some ways a misnomer because it connotes a banking and investment community that was not in existence in Tulsa. This was much more of a Black Main Street. So these were, again, small enterprises, mostly mom and pop type operations, and professional service providers in a segregated economic environment in the city of Tulsa. Jim Crow segregation was rife in Tulsa at the time. And I say that the Black community faced an economic detour. That is, they approached the gates of economic opportunity in downtown Tulsa and were turned away. They detoured back into the Greenwood district, their home community, and created this Black enclave that was literally the talk of the nation. That Black community, that commercial district, that Black show of industriousness and economic prowess was destroyed in the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. That event is emblematic in many ways of the historical racial violence and trauma that befell African Americans all over the nation. What happens in Tulsa in 1921 comes on the heels of Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919, where there were over 24 major so-called race riots all throughout the United States. New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, Longview, Texas, Omaha, Nebraska, and on and on and on. At the same time, lynching, domestic terrorism against African Americans was prevalent all across the United States. So this is a horrific time of racial violence and trauma against African Americans. Open season on Black folks. Tulsa, again, is emblematic of that violence and is unique only in terms of the magnitude of the destruction. Because Black Wall Street was a highly developed Black economic presence, and because members of the white community were jealous of that economic achievement on the part of people who were perceived to be inferior to white people. White supremacy was the ideology of the day. So this community could not be tolerated in Tulsa, and it was destroyed. The big story here really is the story of the indomitable human spirit, because the Black people who envisioned this community, who nurtured the community, who sustained the community. They also resurrected the community after its near destruction in the massacre in 1921. So that is, in a nutshell, the story.
Now, wait a minute. Are you trying to tell me that Black folk in Tulsa, Oklahoma own businesses? Come on now. This is going against the grain that we hear too many places. They owned around 3 or 4 businesses, right? And probably whites put them in it, I'm sure.
There were literally hundreds of Black owned and operated businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Black community in the early part of the 20th century. And I say that what's important for us today, as important as anything else about this history, is to rekindle that Black Wall Street mindset, that psychology around business prowess and entrepreneurial success. Those people did remarkable things against a kind of systemic racism we cannot even imagine today. I would be the last to argue that systemic racism isn't a reality today. It certainly is, but it's not a reality in the way it was in 1921. So those people were incredibly successful, even in the midst of open, obvious, blatant racism and violence. They still managed to be successful businessmen, businesswomen, and entrepreneurs. And so if they can do that, then we know that we have those historical role models that we can leverage to be successful in business and entrepreneurship today, and not facing the same physical geographic constraints that they faced. They were segregated. They were forced to do business within the context of a narrow geographic community. We don't have those constraints. In fact, we have technology. So the globe is really our oyster in terms of our economic opportunity. So let's leverage that history. Let's leverage those incredible icons and create something special today.
In a moment, Doctor, I'm going to ask what happened to us after Wall Street, Black Wall Street, but Barrister, I have another question for you. I need to know how we got to Oklahoma in the first place. I mean, you know, that's not exactly off Route 95 or some other ditch, or the Mississippi for that matter.
Yeah, so we as Americans don't do a really good job of teaching our inclusive history. We do a really good job of marginalizing and diminishing certain people in the context of the mosaic that is our history. So we, for example, we don't teach folk that Black folks and Native folk have really close connections that go way, way back. When we talk about the Trails of Tears, the forced migration of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, we don't tell people that those tribes engaged in the practice of chattel slavery. They enslaved people of African ancestry. We don't talk about the fact that part of the reason we call them civilized is because they adopted white ways. Mm-hmm. And one of the white ways to be adopted was the enslavement of people of African ancestry. So when those tribes were forced out of the Southeast in the 1830s and 1840s on those Trails of Tears, guess who was doing a lot of the hard labor on those forced migrations? A lot of those people were Black folks who were enslaved by the tribal members. The tribes also had free Black people living among them as well. So those part of the early migration of people of African ancestry to Oklahoma comes in the Trails of Tears in the 1830s and 1840s. When Oklahoma then opened up for general settlement in the late 1800s, 1889 land runs, some of the people on those land runs were Black. They came into Oklahoma, staked their claim, and recruited other Black folks to come to Oklahoma. The leading Black booster was a fellow named E.P. McCabe. He had been the highest elected state official in the state of Kansas, state auditor. He came in the land run of 1889. He founded the all-Black town of Langston. Langston is the location of the farthest west of the HBCUs, Langston University.
Wow.
He also set about the business of recruiting other blacks to come to Oklahoma. He talked to the United States President Benjamin Harrison in 1890 about carving out within Oklahoma Territory an all-black state. Think about it. There was real talk, serious talk about an all-black state in what is now Oklahoma. Obviously, that didn't come to pass, but what did come to pass was many all-black towns and communities. Oklahoma had more all-black towns and communities than any other state in the nation.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two big waves of black folks in Oklahoma. One with the Indians, the Trails of Tears, 1830s and 1840s, and then in the late 1800s, as a result of these boosters. And there's this movement called the Exoduster movement.
Yeah.
People leaving the South looking for greener pastures. And Oklahoma, we don't talk about it very often, but Oklahoma was one of those destinations that was desired by some of those exodusters.
Now, Dr. Clarissa Myrick-Harris, you are the chair of the Division of Humanities and a professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse, are you not?
I am.
And I'm sure all of my fraternity and sorority brothers and sisters will have words with me for my stomp just then, but that's all right. We'll take it one step at a time. How did you first hear about this Black Wall Street episode in Black history?
And that's a very, very good question. I consider myself an Africana Studies scholar. I have studied Black history most of my adult life, but I did not really find out about Black Wall Street until I was a graduate student at Emory American Studies with a focus in African American Studies, Africana history, Africana Studies, history, culture. And I found out it by picking up a book. It was a paperback book, and this is many moons ago, decades ago, a paperback called Black Wall Street. And you probably know about it. I don't remember the author. I was looking for it earlier today. I have it someplace in on my bookshelf. It was a paperback, if I remember, like a gray paperback, black letters. I don't even remember how I got it, and I picked it up wherever I got it. I was going through it and I'm going, oh my God. And the first thing I thought about was that this is a story that we've heard over and over. Black Wall Street in Tulsa was perhaps at that time the largest, wealthiest of the all Black towns, all Black communities in existence. But it was not the only one that experienced this kind of racial terrorism, this kind of massacre. And so I began to do more and more reading. And of course, in Atlanta, I'm in Atlanta, a native Atlantan. And it was not until I was an adult and studying that I even heard about what was called the Atlanta riot of 1906. It was the Atlanta massacre of 1906. And I'm reading about Tulsa and remembering the history of Atlanta. And I'm going, this is a story. This is not an anomaly. This is something that is not an isolated occurrence. One time, maybe 2 times, perhaps, but it's not. And if you dig deeper and deeper, and you learn more and more, you know that these kinds of assaults, these acts of domestic racial terrorism have occurred throughout the history of people of African descent in this country. And if you look at, and I think there have been several in recent years, we have digital representations now, several websites, and people can Google Black massacres in America. And there's one site, I think it was done by the Washington Post, and they document like 24 all Black towns that were destroyed, in which there were massacres. And quite frankly, we know that there were more. These are the ones that were documented. And so when you hear this history, when you read this history, the first thing that popped into my mind when I read about Tulsa, about Atlanta, about Wilmington, about Rosewood, Florida, about in Georgia, we have 3 or 4 big such occurrences, acts of racial tourism on Black communities. Camilla, Georgia, where a number of Black politicians were massacred because they voted. They formed a coalition with white Republicans right after the war. Linville, outside of Athens, Georgia. Well, quite frankly, in recent years, that community was raised to build dorms for UGA. So you hear this story over and over again. As Mr. Johnson talked about, the lynchings that have occurred over time. And I think we have documented just between the Reconstruction era and maybe the 50s and 60s, we have more than 5,000 documented cases of lynching, but we know there were hundreds, if not thousands more that were never documented. And so what is this? What do we call this? Yes, we have these massacres, we have these killings. You have to call a thing what it is, and it's genocide. People don't like to use that word, but especially when you talk about America, those two words don't go together, not supposed to go together. But what is genocide?
Why was this? If there was a genocide, if you'll pardon me, if there was as what you call genocide, why was this? Why did these things happen?
Well, very, very simple reasons. There was fear, and there was jealousy, and there was a desire to reassert over and over again white supremacy. So, racism, systemic racism is at its core. And the white supremacist, the white nationalist perspective is at the core. Jealousy of Black progress. When you're telling the world that Black people, first of all, are not even human, a beast, there should be beast of burden. That's why they were enslaved, because that's all Black people could do. Do what you tell them to do, beast of burden. And when you have when you have towns, when you have individuals, when you have institutions that contradict that over and over again, that makes a lot of people angry. You're contradicting their truth, their reality. And there's fear, there's anger, there's rage. And so the desire is to destroy that. But when you say the term genocide, there's almost a hushed silence, or people say, well, what is it other than that? If you understand what that is, and that term was created, it was 1948, it was after the Holocaust. And then there was the UN, there was an actual commission, genocide Genocide Convention, 1948, in which there was a definition going. So listen to this definition. Genocide, acts committed to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, or religious group. These acts included killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Okay, so we're not only talking about murders, these massacres certainly fit that description, but we're also talking about systems in place, systemic and systematic efforts to essentially ensure that the quality of life of a specific group of people is unbearable and will lead to demise, to death, to issues. So these acts include not only killing, but causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of this particular group, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. What is this? What are we talking about? Lynchings, massacres, forcing of individuals off their land. Black farmers were forced off land, just have been and continue to be, quite frankly. We have conditions in our schools in which it's still, even today, the education that our children of African descent and other communities of color receive is not on par with the education received in white communities or elite upper class communities. You have issues in terms of employment, in terms of housing. You have mass incarceration. You have policing that it results in the death of disproportionately African American men, women, and children, unfortunately. And so all these factors come together in my mind. If you know the history, if you know the definition, we're talking genocide.
Wait a minute, attorney, couldn't another way of looking at this instead of genocide be just greed? Couldn't it be just a question of greed and not so much a question of race?
Well, there are a lot of things going on, and the fundamental construct, which is a social construct, of course, race, is controlling in the circumstances that we're talking about. Even in terms of nomenclature, what we call these events. So we've had discussions locally about the event that was initially called in the history books the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. A couple of years ago, people decided that they wanted to take more control over the nomenclature and chose the term massacre. But so for me, when I talk to people and I have at least a little bit of time, I say that for me, what's really important when we talk about these naming opportunities is the critical thinking. So we should ask ourselves a number of questions when it comes to what things are called. And with respect to the event in Tulsa in 1921, let's ask ourselves, who named this event? Who was absent from the table when the name was given out? What is the significance of the naming of the event? So the initial name riot is significant because many insurance policies of the day had exclusionary clauses, and they wouldn't pay damages to policy holders if the damage was occasioned by riot or civil unrest. So calling it a riot had significance. Then, once we know the facts, let's ask ourselves, what alternative titles or denominations or names might we give this event? In the case of the Tulsa event, there are many things we could call the event, all of which apply at some level. So riot is something, it does apply to some degree. It might not be the best, but it applies. But so does massacre. Massacre applies as well. But there's a problem even with the term massacre, because several people have told me, and it is true, the Black men in the Tulsa community put up a vigorous, robust defense against the invasion.
Yes.
It was short-lived because they were outnumbered and outgunned, and the mob had the assistance of the law enforcement officers. But they did put up a defense, and massacre for some people diminishes the extent to which Black men went to defend the community. So let's riot, there's massacre, assault, Holocaust, which is destruction by fire, ethnic cleansing, genocide, the European term pogrom, which has to do with a devastating massacre and taking people away from their homelands.
Right.
And so we know that looking at the records, there's evidence that some people in the white community, including railroad executives, wanted to move the Black community farther and take that land for a railroad depot. So pogrom might be an appropriate term. Some people at the time, survivors, called it a race war. So there are all sorts of things that we could call this event. So then my final question for people in terms of critical analysis is, if you were empowered to name this event and the event happened today, what would you call it and why? So again, who named the event? Who was absent from the table? What's the significance of the name? What are some alternatives that we might consider? If it happened today, what would you call it? So that it's the thinking process that matters more than the landing point, ultimately. Yes. It's how you think through this issue of nomenclature.
Exactly.
And that forces you to think about a lot of things that are analogous to these events in Tulsa, our history around race, not just in Tulsa, but in the United States and the world generally. Critical analysis, critical thinking is absolutely essential as we grapple with these difficult issues around race and history.
Yes.
I see why you are the chair of the education committee of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, sir. I got a whole education right there. You're right. The word is so important. What's in the name? What's in the word?
Everything.
Exactly. And it's so important that whatever the name is, it's in the case of these massacres, assaults, wars, race wars, whatever we call them, that that name is not a name that that indicates that this is an isolated occurrence, or this is something that is not connected to a history of this kind of violence.
Absolutely.
That it culminates, that it is continuing a process, an assault that has occurred over time. And I don't mean to harp on that term. It's just that when you say the term genocide, there is almost automatic reaction, excuse me, that people have, Black people as well. Well, yeah, it was bad. You know, we were killed, hundreds, thousands over time, but genocide? And they say that because that term has generally been associated with crimes in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Europe, and but never in America. Never in America.
And you know what? One thing that that brings up in my mind is this whole notion of American exceptionalism.
Sure.
That's really what you're getting at, and that is we have this tendency to idealize everything American, which causes us to sanitize our history and leave out the inconvenient parts.
Right. Exactly. And so that's why it's important for us collectively as Black people and other peoples around the world to, again, call a thing what it is. In 1951, 70 years ago, and what, 30 years after Tulsa, there was a convention. Okay, there was a group of leaders, Black leaders, who met. At the forefront was a man named William Patterson. And the document they produced was called We Charge Genocide. This is 1951. Their goal was to take that document to the UN, the meeting in Paris, in France. And unfortunately, many tried to prevent them from doing that. You know, to go for the U.S., to go before the UN, to say that America is guilty of genocide. Oh no, you can't do that. And this was, you know, at a time in 1951, we're talking about the Cold War, and then you add to that Patterson, he was a card-carrying communist, but there were others among that group who were not. You know, they were leaders in the community. And because of that connection to, and you know, during that time, like during the period of the Red Scare, you know, when you have individuals who are perceived as socialists or communists, then, you know, you just run from them. If you're Black, you run from them, even though the history is history, truth is truth, regardless of who says it. And so they were silenced. Du Bois was a part of this group. Paul Robeson was a part of this group, and we know what happened to both of them. But that document, which still holds true even now, 70 years later, and they lay out in very, very succinct detail. And if you Google it, We Charge Genocide, you'll see there's even, I think, a Google Play document that gives you at least a part of it, if not all of it. But they break it down and note that not only the massacres, not only the lynchings, not only the stealing of land, but the incident, the fact that the housing is inadequate, the fact that educational system is inadequate, and they call out specifically policing that results in the murders, disproportionate murders of Black people. All this is in that document in 1951. So the Black Lives Matter movement, this movement to reimagine policing, this is not something that has just recently been on the minds of Black people. We just have short memories, and we don't build on the efforts of those who came before. And when you do acknowledge what has come before, the efforts made before, and you pull from that to show this long history, then it becomes all the more powerful, and you can accomplish all the more. So call a thing what it is what I say we must do.
Well, I want to call a couple of things out. First, I want to call Mr. Johnson. Why didn't you run? Why are you still in Tulsa? Why aren't you in LA or in Chicago or wherever people run? You bumped into the same history. You must have at one point gotten quite outraged. Why are you still there?
Well, let me just turn the question on you. Why wouldn't I be in Tulsa? I mean, I grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, 100 miles southeast of here. I went to law school at Harvard on the East Coast, but that's not my hood. I mean, that's not where I'm from. So I came back to the home region. And in many ways, I stumbled into this history, and it's become a real passion for me. And it just sort of played out the way it plays out.
Okay, I'll go with it. How did you stumble into this, sir?
So when I got here, I came here to work for a law firm, and I worked for that law firm for several years. But also, my parents taught me the value of being a community servant. So I wanted to be engaged in the community. And one of the first things I did was I ended up writing a guest editorial column for the Black newspaper on a regular basis. And I was asked at one point to do a series on the history of the Black community, the Greenwood district here, Black Wall Street. At the time, I knew very little about that history, but I became increasingly interested, so interested that I decided to write a book. At this point, I've written 10 books, 4 of which are about the history of the Black Wall Street, the Black community here. But the others are mostly about the African-American experience in one way or the other, mostly history. So, it just became a passion for me, and it became part of my work life as well, not just a sideline, but part of my actual professional work life.
Well, where do we go from here, Barrister? Where does America go? Well, I guess first let's start with Afrocentric. Where does Black America go from here on this issue of the Tulsa Massacre and whatever else we want to call it? Where do we go from here? And then, Professor, if you could tell me where America as a whole goes from here, I'd appreciate it. But to you, attorney.
So I think the pathways are similar. So Tulsa can be an example. For me, what I want to see is what Dr. King would call a beloved community.
Okay.
It's a community that is rife with people who are compassionate and empathetic and seek to understand one another. For me, that involves a 3-step process: acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. So acknowledgement is embracing our history, warts and all. It's doing things like we're doing here, we just built Greenwood Rising, a history center that gives you an experiential, immersive vantage on this history. And at the end of the Greenwood Rising experience, we ask patrons who visit the facility to think about what is it that you've learned here that you can apply to current challenges. Mass incarceration, Black Lives Matter, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, and police community relations. What is it that you learned or have been inspired to focus on that you can use to challenge the issues that we face today? And also, what is it that you will do with your agency, your individual capacity to be a change maker? What is it that you will do to make a difference? So acknowledgement is embracing our history, teaching our history, making sure curriculum is sound around our history and all that. Apology is both literal apologies from people who need to apologize, and we've had some of those. In fact, we just had an apology from our current mayor and from our city council with respect to the events of 1921. But it's more than that. It's developing within the community senses of compassion and empathy so that people understand that we are living within and among people who have suffered historical racial trauma, and we need to deal with that. And then atonement has to do with the word that you've already used this word. I'll use the word reparations. So, and when I say reparations, I mean the dictionary definition. What is it that we do to repair the damage from or to make amends for what happened in 1921? How do we dress these historical wounds that we have? And that's not just a Tulsa question, that's an American question. There are communities all over the country, and there's the country writ large that has to answer that same question. So one way to do that might be to give a sum of money to particular individuals based on some criteria that some body has developed. But that's only one way. Other ways include investments, economic investments in the health and well-being of targeted communities, like the Black community, for example. Other examples might include investments in education and curriculum, such that we do a better job of actually teaching successive generations this hard history that we've too long ignored. Other examples include communal or collective investments in facilities and structures that are places which we can meet on common ground and advance ourselves in terms of race and dismantle systemic racism. So these might be museums, they might be other kinds of public facilities, etc. So it's acknowledgement, apology, and atonement for me that really define the path toward racial reconciliation, which is not an endpoint, but is rather a journey.
Well, doctor, you've heard one prescription. We will turn to your educational prescription for America as a whole. What realize the answer?
I will just echo what Mr. Johnson has said. I agree with everything he has said. I think some immediate things that we all can do, and some would argue, well, these things don't go far enough. It's not enough, but it's a start. We can start by supporting the HR 40. That's the piece of legislation that would establish a national commission to, first of all, study, explore, and understand the need for reparations. What would it mean? What are those events in our history that would lead us to an understanding that reparations are needed? What might those reparations be? So this commission, national commission, there is a bill that's made it through the House, and now it's, of course, before the Senate, HR 40. So demand that your public servants, your politicians, your representatives support that establishment of the commission, reparations commission. We can support the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of this year. This has come, this was put forth, I think in February, again, to change the way policing is done. And some argue, and I agree to some extent, it doesn't go quite enough, but it's a start because like many, including those with the Obama Foundation's Reimagining Policing initiative, there is a need to totally transform policing, public safety in America so that these entities, the 18,000 police departments, small and large and medium size, so that they truly are living up to the motto, protect and serve. And then there's a need to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You know that back in 2013, the Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 1965, was really savaged. It was butchered, and it was made impotent by the taking out important aspects of it. So that John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore aspects of that 1965 Voting Rights Act that have been eliminated. So we start there, but then, and this is echoing much of what Mr. Johnson said, there is an organization which is a coalition of groups and individuals who are seeking a united effort, united front in the reparations movement, the National African American Reparations Commission. And so they have a 10-point plan, again, that includes much of what Mr. Johnson has already said. You start with an apology and Maafa Institute, a formal apology and establishment of an African Holocaust Institute. And in the African world, we call the Holocaust the Maafa. 2, repatriation, and that is giving resources and support to individuals of African descent who want to go to the motherland, either to live or to establish some connection. And beyond that, for those of us who choose to stay, making sure that there is this ongoing connection and a knowledge program so that we understand our history and culture. That's what's missing by so many of us, just that connection to our history, not only here, but in the nation, the continent of our ancestors. 3, land, the right to land for social and economic development. 4, funds for cooperative enterprises and socially responsible entrepreneurial development. Health and wellness, that's their number 5 point. The 5th point, resources for the health, wellness, and healing of Black families and communities. The disparities in healthcare are just astounding when it comes to the Black community. It's as low and lacking as in the most destitute third world countries, right here in America. So that's a major point. 6 is education, education for community development and empowerment. 7 is housing and wealth generation, affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth generation. So giving and not giving, restoring the power that we once had on Black Wall Street and Sweet Auburn and all the communities around the country that were the heartbeat of Black America. 8, information, strengthening Black America's information and communications infrastructure. That digital divide still exists. And we really saw that in what has occurred over the last year and a half, right? As America went online. And so many African Americans do not have access to computers, to broadband, all the things they need in order to stay connected and learn. And so establishing, strengthening Black America's information and communications infrastructure is key. Number 9, sacred sites and monuments, preserving Black sacred sites and monuments. I'm a public historian, so that is so very important. We need to be able to see to restore sites of importance to Black America, see monuments, statues, and historical markers that commemorate individuals, events, and other important aspects of American history, Black American history. And these sites would essentially not be done in isolation, but it's so important to help everyone understand that Black America is not just a footnote, but it is, we have contributed to, in large measure, the development, the fabric of this country. And 10, the criminal justice system. And I could talk all day about that, so I won't even go into it. But in addition to policing, the judicial system and the prison system, we know we need dramatic reforms when it comes there because of the disproportionate numbers of people of African descent who are caught up in that system. So those are my recommendations.
Worthy recommendations all, but I have a problem, Mr. Johnson. I've heard these great recommendations, but I got many problems, but I know that there are at least 3 survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and everybody seems to be talking from the president on up or down or sideways, and yet nobody seems to be trying to make those 3 people whole while they are alive. What's up with that? Why is this?
There's a lot of stuff going on in the background that we don't have time to talk about, but I will say that 20 years ago, there was the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. That's its official title. At the time, there were more than 100 living survivors. One of the projects of the commission was to interview those survivors. So those survivors were interviewed and cataloged. I actually knew some of those people when they were living. And in talking with them, what they wanted more than anything else was that their story be told, that their voice be heard. So I'm not saying that they didn't support cash reparations or other kinds of reparations. For most of the ones that I talked to, their first priority was that they be heard around their story and their history, their place in history, that people know who they were, what happened to them, and why it's important for successive generations to know that. So when we talk about reparations in the broad sense, making amends and repairing the damage, we need to be honest and critical and think about what types of reparations actually make the kind of difference, structural, systemic differences that we need to have made. Is it giving you a particular sum of money? Because, again, the moral case for giving you the money, if you're a survivor, is unquestioned. It absolutely is deserved. But if we're talking about making the most impact on the systems that cause the disparities and the inequities that we seek to remedy, is that the be all and end all? And I would suggest that it's not. It's part of a larger bundle of possibilities. And we have to think about the big picture, making structural, systemic, institutional changes that will, in generations to come, lead toward a more equitable, racially speaking, society.
So
I agree with that. But I also think money is in order as well.
Yeah.
Or cash is in order as well.
Yeah, it's one part of, yeah, it's both and, not both either
and, or. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I can deal with both ands. But did any of this happen to these people? To the 100 that you spoke of, and to the 3 who are still here?
If I remember correctly, Mr. Johnson, there was at one point, I think, who was it who did the research? Ms. Gates, in her research,
Eddie Fay,
interviewed several people who said that at some point there were lawsuits filed. There were lawsuits that were unsuccessful, and there was a case in which there was a successful lawsuit, but it's not clear they ever really got any compensation.
Yeah, the lawsuit was deemed barred by the statute of limitations. There were some symbolic small reparations payments made by private organizations. There recently was a different lawsuit filed that's still pending under a different theory. There was a reparations fund privately set up for, I think the one fund set up by the Ministerial Alliance called Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry was, I think they may have raised $100,000 or something like that. There's a group called Justice for Greenwood that has been raising money for a fund for these 3 individuals that are survivors at still living today. And so there are some background issues that are pending, more complex than we can talk about here.
Yes.
Okay, I know that Greenwood is in the middle of a building boom, I've been told. How much of that is gentrification? Do we own any of Greenwood now?
So the answer is yes. Do we, meaning Black people, own some of Greenwood? Yes. Much of the land is not owned by Black folks, but that's not a recent thing. The land changed hands for the most part in the 60s and 70s because of integration, because of urban renewal. Urban renewal movements around the country had the effect in Tulsa that they had in Minneapolis and Indianapolis and DC. And I know that because I've spoken in those places.
Mm-hmm.
And so urban renewal projects, no matter how well intentioned, they often affect communities that have the least capacity politically to resist. So urban renewal projects often target, for example, so-called blighted properties. Well, one of the things that happened with integration, ironically in Tulsa, is, remember, the Greenwood community was a community of necessity, and it was successful because Black dollars were trapped in that community. That's actually a good thing if you own a business in the Greenwood community. Integration allows those dollars to flow outside the community. It erodes the financial foundation of the community. That erosion, that economic downturn, creates blighted properties.
Right.
Blighted properties are red meat for urban renewal. Urban renewal seeks out those blighted properties. Land ownership changes hands. People they end up selling either because economic necessity or political pressure. Then urban renewal in Tulsa puts a highway right through the Black community. And so
yes,
the businesses then fold because their potential markets have been
exactly.
destroyed or somehow disabled because of the location of that highway,
Exactly.
which compounds the problem.
That
So what we have
in Atlanta.
it happens all over the place. And
Yeah.
what happened in Tulsa is that now a lot of the land in the Greenwood community, some of it's owned by the successor to the Urban Renewal Authority called the Tulsa Development Authority. Oklahoma State University, one of our big flagship state schools, has a campus right in the heart of the Greenwood district. Some of the properties, the building that I'm in, for example, is owned by the Greenwood Chamber, which is a Black chamber, but it's leveraged property. And again, I lease space in this property. The Greenwood Rising, the history center that we just built, just because of the generosity of a foundation who owned the land, they actually donated the land to Greenwood Rising. So that land is actually back in Black hands through a remarkable twist of fate. So today the Greenwood community it's being reinvigorated, but not as a Black business mecca. It's different in character. It's an integrated community. The one thing that we have in common, I think, among all the people in the community is that there is this interest in making sure that this history is preserved and that we leverage the history.
Yes.
So it's a different kind of community, but it's a community that I think by and large understands its roots and is committed to leveraging those roots and projecting what I talked about earlier, which is the Black Wall Street mindset, which is not something that has to be deployed here in the Greenwood community. It can be deployed in New York City, or in Albany, or in wherever we are.
Well,
Exactly.
we are approaching the end of our conversation, and it flies. And you're right. When all of us get off this line, I'm sure that we will think of 100 additional points that should have been made. Now you're going to get a few seconds to put your last thought out there. What do you want people to walk away with when they think of the Black Wall Street experience of Tulsa, past, present, and future for that matter? What do you want people? What is your message to the world, Doctor? We will start with you since we started with the barrister before.
Sure. I want people to be inspired. I want people to know the history, to know the tragedy, to know that that Black community was destroyed as a result of racial terrorism. But beyond that, I want them to be inspired and strengthened, and to really use that history, that story, to spur them to do great things. As Mr. Johnson said early on, and you too, I think, Senator, you know, during that time when Black people had so little, they were able to do so much in spite of the constant around the clock threat of violence against them, the lack of resources, segregation, just a whole range of things. If they were able to do all of that during those times, what great things we have not even imagined can we not do as a people if we get into that mindset once again. And so inspiration, I want people to be inspired, know the history and the tragedy, but be inspired to replicate that kind of wealth, that kind of pride, that kind of legacy.
Sir, yours is the penultimate word on this one.
We are the heirs of kings and queens, and our legacy is the indomitable human spirit as demonstrated by the icons of the Greenwood district.
Mm-hmm.
To the point. My friends, I have really enjoyed, not really, we're blessed to make your acquaintance in this, through this media. I had the sneaky suspicion that we will speak again on another day. And I look forward to that. I mean, so many points. I wanted to raise some. I wanted to speak of the Black folk who put up the resistance. There's talk that they were part of the African Blood Brotherhood, a forerunner of the Black Panther Party. I mean, there's so much that could be said here, but alas, time was not our friend. But I will say this, I will say that the past is prologue, that we study the past so that we can understand today. Yes. And we study the past because we want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. And one of the most horrible things that I think this system has done to us is to get people to hate their past and to not want to. I hear people talk about, oh, I don't like history. How it baffles my mind. It's impossible. How do you not like yourself? Well, there I go thinking again. It's not, you may not like the way it has been taught to us. You may not like the glaring omissions of your own history, and where we get his story. Yes, and it's true, we need our story. But if you, Malcolm X taught us, he said, history is the most rewarding of subjects. And I believe that. I believe that if we just study, we can see where were the pitfalls that we fell in, what holes. When we hear these great debates taking place, there are historical antecedents. You didn't fall from the sky, my friends. Right. There's stuff that went on before you. And even as we rise, we have to figure out, yes, let's create some more Black Wall Streets, but let's also figure out how to make sure that they are defensible. How do we make sure that we can keep them so that we won't lose more Rosewoods or the sundown towns and all of these things that are our history. Now I'm having fun here because I have the last word, and it's so unfair to these other speakers because they could tell you the things that I'm saying times 1,000 probably. But if you want to know more, then I would encourage you to follow either of these folk. And I'm sure that they have, and if they were wise, they would put something in the chat so that people can get in touch with them. And I'm buying them a few moments of time so they can, I hope that you guys type faster than I do, man. I tell you, if you don't, you'll never make it. But when you find some smart people, you make it your business to stay around them. When you find some folk who know your history, our history, you make it your business to stay around them. These folk are doing an incredible contribution to our story, staying in places where folk feel that you should run from, and going from Atlanta, Georgia, where part of the Trail of Tears, my friends. Let's be clear, it's all one, and there's a whole bunch of tears, but we won't speak about that now. If ever there was a conversation where we were clear on this one, and that's why the show is called Let's Be Clear, and you were with Senator James Sanders Jr. and these outstanding stars in the African firmament, and I am grateful to have their acquaintance. Let's be clear. Let's come back again. Thank you both for being here. I thank you both. Take care. Let's stay in touch.